So I'm just talking to the webcast people too. Okay, very good. Kate, would you like to kick us off, please?
Sure. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I am Kate Nevins, the Executive Director of Lyrasis, and I'm really glad to welcome you to our webinar today, no matter what time zone or postal code you are in. It's exciting to think of people all over the world who are joining us today. We have had a long commitment to open source software at Lyrasis, and that includes such things as providing introductory webinars, training on open source concepts and decision making, hosting the FOSS for Lib decision support tools site, and also hosting some open source services for users, and those would be Islandora, archive space, and soon to be collection space. And not but certainly, but not least, is our organizing of this symposium for discussion on issues related to open source software in the cultural heritage world. I can't go any further without thanking the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their funding so that we could make this webinar available to everyone at no cost. So wherever you are, face towards New York and say, thank you, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. They are very generous in their support of open source developments. You know, open source software is relatively or deceptively easy. On one hand, the source code is widely available for anyone to use. On the other hand, it takes significant effort to build a community so that the software and knowledge base can grow and thrive. The purpose of this symposium is to provide a forum for discussion of support practices within the field and to further cooperation of cultural heritage organizations with common interests in sustainable open source software. We have two broad topics to discuss today and tomorrow. Today we are focusing on how open source projects can create the right conditions to promote engagement from the community of software users. We have three knowledgeable panelists today who are going to offer their perspectives and participate in a discussion with you. Tomorrow we will broadcast a focus with a focus on what it means to an institution to adopt open source services. The symposium is structured to provide maximum interaction between the panelists and the participants. I encourage you all to use the discuss.foss.org to engage with each other on the topic. Peter Murray, who is our moderator for the symposium, will surface threads from the discussion site to the panelists, and the panelists will be interacting with you on the discussion site. In a moment, Peter will lead you through a tutorial, and in the meantime, I encourage you to go to discuss.fossforlib.org and sign up for an account. The discussion site will also remain open after the live broadcast so that you can continue the dialogue and add new topics as they occur to you. Open source software is one of my favorite topics because of the large collaborative aspect that it relies on and fosters. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, which is an African proverb: if you want to travel fast, go alone. If you want to travel far, go together. Let's focus today on the open source community and how we can travel far together. I'd like to turn it over to Peter Murray, our moderator.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears over here for just a moment. Our original plans for the symposium were to have a face-to-face meeting. But as we went through the planning of that, we realized that we were running counter to our goal of having broad participation. We wanted a lot of people to participate in this conversation, but to have an in-person meeting would automatically put up barriers of travel and participation. So we're going to try it this way. We have this live broadcast, which you're watching right now. And we have an interactive discussion site for you to use. As Kate said, the address is discuss.fossforlib.org. You may have observed conferences that have lively back channels on Twitter and other things. And what we're hoping to do with this format is to surface those back channel conversations on this Discuss platform so that we can all see it, so that we can have the presenters and panelists react to those things as well. And since this is something new to maybe you, I want to take a few minutes to introduce you to that. We're using a piece of software called Discuss to facilitate our group discussions, and you need to sign up at discuss.fossforlib.org. There is a sign up button right here. You have many choices that you can use to sign up. If you have one of these other accounts, you can link it to this site, or you can create an account right on here. You'll receive an email message that confirms your email account is active. And so while I'm talking, before the actual presenters start talking, I encourage you to go through the process of signing up. After you do get signed up, your screen will look something like this. To get familiar with the system, I encourage you to come to this topic called Welcome, Please Introduce Yourself. And we have several people that have come here and have introduced themselves. This is a place where you can do the same thing. You can reply to a particular thread, or down here at the bottom is a reply to the topic in general. This comes as 2 stages now. Everything you type on the left will show up in the preview window on the right. That is great timing because I'm about to need both hands. Thank you. So what we put here, no, I think that's good. Okay. And you can use bold and italic. You can add links to things if you want to. You can click and drag images onto here. Everything that you're doing will replicate itself over here on the right side, right half of the window. When you're done, you can hit reply. I do want to call attention to our community guidelines. We want to make this a welcome community, so we have a code of conduct that outlines what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate for the site. Again, as you're listening to me before the main presenters come and talk, please browse through this. It can be summarized as this is a civilized place for civil discussion. And if you're following that rule, you're generally okay. There are a couple places that you can give clues to us as moderators and also to each other. If something is not in line with the code of conduct, please flag it. Our moderators will look at that and take appropriate action, including deleting the post and or suspending the person if necessary. On the other side, you can also like things. I'm going to like Melanie's comment here. Thank you for joining. When you like things, these surface to the top of the list, and that helps me as a moderator surface those questions and ideas to the panelists. There's going to be lots of ways you're going to get notifications of updates. We can see one of them right here in the speech bubble. I have since I just signed up, I have a new welcome to the FOSS4Lib discussion site which is a kind of a summary of the things that I'm talking about right now. But we can also go to the main page. You'll see sometimes numbers here off to the sides of topics. Those represent new posts that you haven't seen yet, so that's how you know something is new. If there's a new topic that somebody has created, you'll see a message pop up here that invites you to look at that new topic. I see new things happening here since I've come in. Oh, I earned my first like. Thank you very much, whoever did that. So it's a very interactive site. You don't need to refresh the page for these things to be happening. The site, your web browser is in near constant communication with the server, and this page will dynamically update one new or updated topic. Which one is it? Somebody else introduced themselves. So that's all good. Thank you all for doing that. You're right on task. You'll also be getting email for some updates. That might get a little cumbersome here during the live broadcast, but we want this to be a tool that is used not only for the live broadcast, but also when the live broadcast is off, when we're in our offices and thinking about these topics throughout the rest of the day and tomorrow. We have several topics here already. We have topics for each of the speakers. Janine will be going first, and she has a topic here. If you have questions about her talk, I encourage you to put them into as new posts reply to her topic. There are also several questions, open questions that I'll be posing to the panelists, and you can use those to put your own thoughts and questions in. But also, if you have an entirely new topic about open source software in cultural heritage organizations that isn't covered here, use the create topic and give a brief description of it and type a little bit about your topic here. That will then add to the conversation. Others will see that you have added that topic and will contribute as well. So this is how we're trying to overcome the fact that we couldn't bring all, at last count, over 100 of you to Atlanta for the symposium. Please use the Discuss site as your way of interacting not only with your peers, but also with the panelists here today. Outside the Discuss software, you can also use the hashtag SCHOSS, Symposium for Sustainable Cultural Heritage Open Source Software is what that acronym is. And with that, I think I will turn it over to our first speaker. I think I have this right. Janine Rose Hamperin? Jenny Rose Hamperin, I'm sorry, is a project manager and researcher for the community building team at the Mozilla Corporation, where her work focuses on digital communities and communities of practice on the open web. Prior to Mozilla, she worked in academic libraries, archives, and museums, curation, and digital scholarship in the United States and Germany. She graduated from Barnard College and received her MLS from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Humboldt University in Berlin. Ooh, all right. There we go.
So as Peter said, I'm Jenny Rose Halprin. I'm a project coordinator, manager, researcher at Mozilla on the community building team. And I'm also a former GNOME free and open source software outreach for women intern. I'd like to thank Peter and Lyrasis and also the Andrew Mellon Foundation for bringing me here. It's a real honor. I'd also like to thank the person sneezing behind me the entire plane ride, because I feel awesome today. I often feel like an open source failure. I haven't submitted 500 patches in my free time. I don't spend my after-work hours rating HTML5 apps, and I was certainly not a 14-year-old Linux user. Unlike the group of 15-year-old European boys with whom I write my Mozilla Communities newsletter and hang out with on IRC, I spent most of my time online at that age chatting with my friends on AOL Instant Messenger and doing my homework. I'm a very poor programmer. My Wikipedia contributions are pretty sad. I sometimes use PowerPoint. I never donated my time to open source in the traditional sense until I started at Mozilla as a GNOME intern, and while the idea of data gets me excited, the thought of spending hours cleaning it is another story. I was feeling that way the other day and chatting with a friend about how reading New York Magazine or watching Twin Peaks on Netflix feels like a better choice after work than trying to find a new open source project to contribute to or making edits to Wikipedia, when I got a message from an old friend asking me to help him with his library school application. I dug up my own statement of purpose, and I was extremely heartened to read the words. I'm particularly interested in the interaction between libraries and open source technology. I am interested in innovative uses of physical and virtual space and democratic archival curation, providing free access to primary sources. It felt good to know that I've always been interested in these topics, but I didn't know what that would look like until I discovered my place in the open source community. I feel like for many of us in the cultural heritage sector, the lack of clarity about where we fit in is a major blocker, and I do think it can be associated with contribution to open source more generally. Douglas Atkin, community manager at Airbnb, claims that the two main questions people have when joining a community are they like me, and will they like me? Of course, joining a community is a whole lot more complicated than that, particularly a community of practice, but the lack of visibility of open source projects in the cultural heritage sector can make even locating the appropriate project a whole lot more complicated. As we've discussed in this working group, the ethics of cultural heritage and open source overlap considerably, and the open source community considers those in the cultural heritage sector to be natural allies. In his article, Who Are You Empowering?, Rundle writes, and I quote this article all the time because I believe it's one of the best articles written about library tech recently. A simple measure that improves privacy and security and saves money is to use open source software instead of proprietary software on public PCs. Community-driven, nonprofit, and not good at making money are just some of the attributes that cultural heritage organizations and open source projects have in common. And yet, when choosing software for their patrons, most libraries and cultural heritage organizations have traditionally chosen proprietary systems, and cultural heritage professionals are not traditionally the strongest open source contributors. In my mind, this is caused by a few things. Number one, many people in cultural heritage don't really know what open source is. In a recent survey I ran of the Code for Lib and UNC SILS listservs, nearly every person surveyed could accurately respond to the prompt, define open source in one sentence, though the responses varied from community-based answers to answers solely about the source code. The sample there was biased toward programmers and young people, and perhaps people who knew how to use Google, because many of the answers were taken rote from the first line of the Wikipedia article about open source, which is definitely survey bias. But I think that it is indicative of one of the larger questions of open source. Is open source about the community, or is it solely about the source code? There have been numerous articles written on the subject, many of which I can refer you to, and I am sure that you can refer me to more as well. But this question is fundamental to our work. Many people, librarians and otherwise, will ask, and I would actually argue most people, but I'm operating largely on anecdotal evidence, why should we care about whether or not our code is open if we can't edit it anyway? I just send my problems to the IT department and they fix it. Many people in cultural heritage don't have many feelings about open source versus proprietary because they simply don't know what it is and cannot articulate the value of switching. Proprietary systems don't advertise as proprietary necessarily, but open source advertises as open source. And as I'll get to later, proprietary systems have cornered the market in many ways. This movement from darkness to clarity brings most to mind a story that Kathy Lucer told about the Evergreen Project, where librarians who didn't consider themselves techie jumped into IRC to tentatively ask a technical question, and due to the friendliness of the Evergreen community, soon they were writing the documentation for the software themselves and were a vital part of their community, participating in conferences and growing their skills as contributors. In this story, the open source community engaged the user and taught her the valuable skill of technical documentation. She also took control of the software she uses daily and was able to maintain and suggest features that she wanted to see. The situation was really a win-win all around. What institution doesn't want to see their staff so well trained on a system that they can write the documentation for it? Number two, the majority of the market share in cultural heritage is closed source, closed access software, and they are way better at advertising than open source companies. Last year, my very wonderful boss, a cataloger who once told me that computers were evil and knew more about metadata than almost anyone else I've ever met, came back from ALA midwinter with goodies for me. Pens and keychains and Post-its and tote bags and those cute little staplers. She said, I only took things from vendors we use. And as a side note, and I kind of feel like I can admit it in this crowd, but now that I know that I'm being broadcast globally, I should maybe be careful. I may have just been like too long of a grad student, but I would say just like take everything. Like they're giving it to you. They're there for a reason. So Linux and Firefox OS hold approximately 21% of the world's operating system market share. Interestingly, which actually was really interesting to me when I was doing the research for this talk, this is actually more globally than iOS, but it's still half that of Windows. On mobile, iOS and Android are approximately equal. Similarly, free open source systems for cultural heritage are unfortunately not a high percentage of the American market. Wikipedia has a great list of proprietary versus open source ILSs and OPACs, the languages they're written in, and their cost. I actually couldn't find usage statistics for open source versus proprietary. If anybody has those usage statistics, I would be really interested to see them. But as open source is generally presented in the professional literature as the alternative, I would hasten to say that it has a much smaller market share than proprietary software. And there are lots of reasons for this small market share, but I would argue, as my previous anecdote kind of did for me, that a lot of this has to do with the fact that these proprietary vendors have a lot more money and are therefore a lot better at advertising to people in cultural heritage who are very focused on their work and really just want to be able to install the thing that does the thing and then have it do the thing well enough. An article in Library Journal in 2011 describes open source software as, quote, a lot of work, but a lot of control. As Jack Reed from Stanford and others have pointed out, most of the cost of FOSS in cultural heritage is developer time, and many cultural heritage institutions believe that they don't have those resources. And a bit of a spoiler for tomorrow, John Bryce will prove to you that all communities can come together with limited developer resources in order to maintain vital and robust open source infrastructures. I learned at this year's WikiConference USA that EBSCO had the highest profit margin of any company in the country last year, ahead of both Google and Apple. EBSCO's model is, for more reasons than one, completely antithetical to the, well, not maybe completely, I'm exaggerating, largely antithetical to the ethics of cultural heritage work, and yet they maintain a large portion of the cultural heritage market share in terms of both knowledge acquisition and software. While certain companies like OCLC are working toward a more equitable future, with caveats of course, I would argue that the majority of proprietary cultural heritage systems are providing inferior product to a resource-poor community. Number three, people are tired and overworked, particularly in libraries, and to compound that, they don't think they have the skills to contribute. These are two separate issues, but they're not entirely disparate, so I'm going to tackle them together. There's this conception outside of the library world, particularly in tech, that librarians are secret coders just waiting to emerge from their shells and start categorizing data types instead of MARC records. This is probably a misconception due to a lot of things, including the sheer diversity of types of jobs that people in cultural heritage fill. but hear me out. When surveyed, the skill that entering information science students most wanted to learn is, quote, programming. However, the majority of MLIS programs are still teaching Microsoft Word and beginning HTML as technology skills. Learning to program computers takes time and instruction, and I can't repeat that enough. Learning to program computers takes time and instruction, and while there's always some prodigy who's like, I just read that book, dive into Python, and now I'm an expert programmer. That's not indicative of most people, I would think. While programs like Women Who Code and Girl Develop It can begin the educational process, we're still faced with a workforce that's over 80% female identified, that learn only proprietary systems in their work, and a small number of technology skills in their MLIS degrees. Library jobs and further cultural heritage jobs are dwindling. Many trained librarians, art historians, and archivists are working from grant to grant on low salaries with little security and massive amounts of student loans from both undergraduate and graduate school educations. If they're lucky to get a job, watching Downton Abbey or doing the loads of professional development work they're expected to do in their free time could often seem like a much better choice after work than continuing to stare at a computer screen for a work-related task, or even learning something completely new at the end of the day. For reference, an entry-level computer programmer can expect to make $70,000 per year on average. An entry-level librarian, under 40. I know plenty of people in cultural heritage who have taken 2 jobs or jobs they hate just to make ends meet, and I'm sure that you do too. So one can easily say, contributing to open source teaches new skills. But if you don't know how to make non-code contributions, or the project is not set up to accept those kinds of contributions, you don't necessarily see an immediate payoff in being involved with this project. And there's a chance that you might not be willing to stay up all night learning to code when you have to be at work the next day or raise a family. Programs like software carpentry have proven that librarians, teachers, scientists, and other non-technically computer scientists are really willing to put in that time and to grow their skills. So to make any kind of claim about this without research would be a reach and possibly erroneous. But I would argue that a lot of cultural heritage organizations are not set up in a way to nurture their employees for this kind of professional development. Not because they don't want to necessarily, but because they feel they can't or they don't see the immediate value in it. And I could go on and on about how a lot of these problems are indicative of cultural heritage work being a historically classed and feminized professional grouping, but I'll spare you right now, although, for the people in the room, if you go out to dinner with me later, you might not be spared. People on the web, send me an email. In addition, many open source projects operate with a patches welcome, or go ahead, jump in, or we don't need a code of conduct because we're all nice guys here mindset, which is not helpful to beginning coders, women, or really anyone outside of a few open source fanatics. So I've identified a lot of problems, but the title of this talk is Creating the Conditions for Open Source Communities, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about what works. Diversification, both in terms of types of tasks and types of people and skill sets, as well as a clear invitation to come in, are 2 absolute conditions for a healthy open source community. Ask yourself the question, are you a tight-knit group with a lot of IRC in-jokes that new people may not understand? Are you all white men? Are you welcoming? Paraphrasing my colleague Sean Bolton, the steps to an inviting community is to build understanding, build connections, build clarity, build trust, build pilots, and this creates a build win-win. As communities grow, it's important to be able to recognize and support contributors in a way that feels meaningful. That could be a trip to a conference they want to attend, a LinkedIn recommendation, a professional badge or a reference, or best yet, you could ask them what they want. Our internal phone book for contributors and staff, well, not phone book, but email book, I guess, Mozillians.org, it's our own social network, is adding a preferred recognition system. If you don't know what I want, you can check out my social profile. And the answer is usually chocolate, but I'm easy. Finding diverse contribution opportunities has been difficult for open source since, well, the beginning of open source. Even for us at Mozilla, with our highly diverse international community and hundreds of ways to get involved, we often struggle to bring a diversity of voices into the conversation and to find meaningful pathways and recognition systems for our 10,000 contributors. In my mind, education is perhaps the most important part of bringing in first-time contributors and keeping them. Organizations like Open Hatch and Software Carpentry provide low-cost, high-value workshops for new contributors to locate and become a part of open source in a meaningful and sustained manner. Our Webmaker program at Mozilla introduces technical skills in a dynamic and exciting, pretty much gamified way for every age. Mentorship is the last very important aspect of creating the conditions for participation that I'm going to mention today. Having a friend or a buddy or a champion from the beginning is perhaps the greatest motivator according to research from a variety of different papers and research studies. Personal connection runs deep, and it is a major indicator for community health. I'd like to bring mentorship into our conversation today, and I hope that we can explore that in greater depth in the next few hours. With mentorship and one-on-one connection, you may not see an immediate uptick in your project's contributions, but a friend tells a friend tells a friend, and then eventually you have a small army of motivated cultural heritage workers looking to take back their knowledge, or something. I'm personally a fan of on-the-ground action. You can really be the change you wish to see. Are you working in a cultural heritage institution and are about to switch systems? Help your organization switch to the open source solution and point out the benefits of their community. Learning to program? Check out the Open Hatch list of easy bugs to fix. Are you doing patron education? Teach them LibreOffice or Linux and the values around it. Are you looking for programming in your library? Hold a Wikipedia edit-a-thon. Working in a library? Try working open for a week and see what happens. Already part of an open source community? Mentor a new contributor or open up your functional area for contribution. It's more than just, if you build it, they will come. If you make open source your mission, people will want to step up to this plate. So in order to close, I'm going to tell a story that I can't exactly take credit for, but I'm going to take it anyway. So we have a lot of ways to contribute at Mozilla, from code to running events to learning and teaching the web. It can often be overwhelming to find your fit. And people, we call it the fire hose. People, you'll start joining the community and people are like, well, you know, this link, and this link, and this link, and this link, and you should talk to these people. And like, there are some people in Antarctica doing amazing things. And so it can be a lot. But a few months ago, my colleague decided to create a module and project around updating the Mozilla Wiki, which was a long ignored, frequently used, and under-resourced part of our organization. As an information scientist and a former archivist, I was psyched. The space that I called Mozilla's collective memory was finally being revived. So we started meeting in April, and it became clear that there were other wiki fanatics in the organization who had been waiting for this opportunity to come up. People were creeping out of the woodwork and were psyched to be a part of it. In August, we held a fantastically successful work week, reskinned the wiki, created a regular release cycle, wrote a manual and a best practice guide, and are still going strong with half contributors and half paid staff as a regular working group within the organization. Our work has been generally lauded throughout the project, and we're working hard to make the wiki the resource it can be for contributors and staff. To me, that was the magic of open source. I met some of my best friends that week in London, and at the end of the week, we were a cohesive unit moving forward to share knowledge through our organization and beyond. And isn't that a basic value of cultural heritage work? So I'm still an open source failure. I'm not a code fanatic, and I kind of like my used iPhone. I don't listen to techno and write JavaScript all night, and I would generally rather read a book than go to a hackathon. And despite all this, I still feel like I found my community. I'm involved with open source because I'm ethically committed to it, because I want to educate my community of practice and my local community about what working open can bring to them. So when people ask me how I got involved with open source beyond being mildly interested in the idea, my answer is I had a great mentor, an incredible community and contributor base, and there are many ways to get involved in open source. While this may feel like a new frontier, I know that we can do more and do better. So open up your work as much as you can. Draw on the many, many intelligent people doing work in your field and in the field of open source, Educate yourself and others about the value that open source can bring to your organization. Mentor someone new, even if you're shy. Connect with the community and treat your fellow contributors with respect. Because who knows, you may get an open source failure like me to contribute to your project. Thanks. I'm going to put a version of this talk on my blog with links to all of the things that I referenced, so that if you're interested in any of the quotes or studies or articles that I mentioned, you can see them. Thank you.
We did have a few questions.
Cool.
One of them was exactly what you just mentioned, looking for links to the resources.
Yeah.
And so put it on your blog, but if you could also link to that from your topic on the discussion site so that people can go back and look at it, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Also had a comment from, bring it up here, from Edward Iglesias, I believe it is. Marshall Breeding has some of the stats on integrated library system distribution on his in American libraries, and he provided a link to that as well.
Awesome, thanks.
I was wondering, could you point to some exemplar sites, exemplar projects, and maybe they don't have to be in cultural heritage, that are doing that mentoring now, that are providing that space and bringing people into open source projects? Who should we look to that's doing that well right now?
So mentorship, because it's kind of nebulous and sometimes not super clearly defined. Should it be code mentorship? Should it be personal development mentorship? You know, when you get outside of just like basic, one-on-one mentored bugs, sometimes it becomes a little bit less clear. You know, how are people interacting together? Open Hatch, which I mentioned, is kind of the go-to place for mentorship. There's an organization that someone I work with runs called Social Coding for Good that does really wonderful work around mentorship. If you're interested in technical documentation, Sumo, Support Mozilla, which is our support network, has a buddy system. So as soon as you sign up for the site, you get a buddy, and the buddy introduces themselves and says hello, and kind of invites you in. I'd also say that one thing that we did recently for coding that's produced kind of an intense change, both in terms of mindset and also in terms of just helping people find their way, is every bug in our issue tracker that's tagged good first bug is a mentored bug. So if you want to pick up a good first bug, or if you want to label something as a good first bug, you also have to commit yourself as a code mentor. And that has been great. And so, the other thing that we do is once you've been contributing for 6 months, you can become a Mozilla rep, and then you get a mentor. So my mentor, I'm also a Mozilla rep, because I've been there for a year. And so my Mozilla rep mentor kind of helped me through the process of how to get involved. We're really experimenting a lot at Mozilla with different ways to think and talk about mentorship. Open Hatch does it largely in terms of in-person events, but I would say that it could be as easy as having a forum where people are hanging out, whether it's like a forum like this, like a discourse forum, or if it's an IRC channel, or if it's a chat room, or whatever it is, and just always having someone there to say hi, direct people to the right place. Finding your place in a project can be really confusing. I know that, just for an example, I went into the IRC room, Pound Introductions, which is our beginning coding good first bug room, and I lurked for a really long time. And you'll see that there'll be a lot of like lurkers in your project sometimes, like people who are just not sure where they can find their place, and that's totally cool. That's totally great. And hopefully, you know, by being a friendly community, by being open, by inviting people in, you can kind of try to, you can ask people if they want to actually join without forcing anybody to do anything that they don't want to do. But if they're lurking, they're clearly interested in the topic.
Thank you. Again, if you have other questions, we're going to convene a panel discussion after all of our speakers. So continue to post those questions. At this point, though, I would like to introduce Megan Forbes. Megan is the Community Outreach and Support Manager for Collection Space, working to raise awareness and foster adoption of the open source application and the organizational home services that support it. She has been part of the Collection Space project team since its inception in 2008, serving as both project manager and functional head. Before joining Collection Space full time, Megan was the director of collection at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York, a position I envy, having visited that museum, where she oversaw the use, management, and care of the collection and provided strategic guidance for collection-related technology selection and implementation. Megan has an MA in Library and Information Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And let me bring your slides up, Megan.
Which, if you do the acronym for that, an MALIS, it makes us out to be much crueler than we really are. So the good thing is that I think that Jenny and I will touch on a lot of the same topics. So maybe the question's been answered. We've got it. But I will speak fairly specifically about the experience that we've had with Collection Space, building that community. So a little bit more of a case study about Collection Space. So I will start with a brief overview of what Collection Space is and how it came to be, and then jump into a discussion of our community engagement practices. I will be focusing primarily on engaging non-technical, or at least non-coding, members of the community, but I will also out Richard Millay, who is in the room and is the Collection Space technical lead, who, just as I work on the outreach side, trying to bring in those end users, Richard has a similar mandate to expand our technical contributor community. So you can bother him after this and via the discussion website if you want to learn more about that, although his answer might be, I'm thinking about it. So, what is Collection Space? I won't read the slide. It's a web-based collections information system for museums and other collecting organizations. If this isn't a domain you're familiar with, imagine an object in a museum, say this chair. Although I guess I could have used a moving image example, which would have been like a Luke Skywalker action figure. So there's a lot of information museum staff needs to manage about this chair. What is it? Where did it come from? And might have one more. So now, where is it? Where did it come from? Where is it stored now? So now multiply that amount of information times the thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of objects that a museum has in its collection, and that's an awful lot of information to keep track of. So the collections management software landscape is dominated, as is much of the world, by several large proprietary applications, all of which suffer from the same issues as most proprietary software. They're expensive, they can't be customized, and users have little to no control over the functionality. As noted in the slide, these drawbacks mean that a large part of the museum community cannot afford to deal with a proprietary system. This lack of ability to adopt has real consequences for the community. As recently as 2007, close to a third of museums and historical societies had no catalog records for the objects in their collections. And half of all collecting institutions had none of their collections information available online. Tribal and nonprofit organizations, surprisingly, are the most likely to have none of their collections cataloged. So this hits hardest with the people, obviously, who are least able to adopt this type of software. So in 2008, we launched the Collection Space Project to try and solve some of these issues and provide a viable alternative to the commercial offerings. So one of our very earliest tenets and one of my first recommendations in encouraging community participation is ask, don't tell. Rather than assume we knew exactly what people wanted in a collections management system, before writing a line of code, we had a series of community design workshops. We invited professionals from a wide range of museums. Here's some of the people who came to our community design workshops. There are museums of all sizes. You see a library dead center. There's galleries, contemporary art, archaeology, all domains, and people who held all types of different roles. So the sort of lowliest assistant registrar to the IT guy, whatever he might be. He's probably also a curator, the director of the museum. So we had a really wide range of roles. And at the workshops, we didn't talk about existing collections management systems. We didn't say, how do you do this in the system that you have and don't like? Or how do you put data into your Excel spreadsheet? We talked and talked and talked about all of the things that we do every day. We acquire new objects, we create condition reports, we write loan agreements, and then we talked about how we could create software to support all this. So we started with processes, procedures, who do I talk to, what documents do they need to get, and then what can we create to support that? Because a lot of times if you start talking about software, then it just gets into a let's complain for 3 days about all of the things that our software does or doesn't do the way I want it to do. So here's a transcript of just some of the notes. So we set people off on a topic, talk about acquisition, talk about what do you need to do when you acquire an object, and walk through the process and walk through the steps. And then we took all of that and turned it into a wireframe of here's where you're going to put all that data, here's where you're going to make all of those connections. After those design workshops, we spent a year working on user interface and technical design, soliciting community input all along. Now, we had a very expansive view of community at this point. We didn't have any software, so we had no user community. So we viewed the entire museum field as our community and worked to solicit feedback and input from a wide range of people throughout the process. So here are some more wireframes. These are just some little wireframes that show a number of different interactions people might have. And then some excellently nitpicky feedback. Need to be able to add a field. Why can't we undo? Can we modify the controlled lists? Why can't I go back and see the search I just did? The relationships are not duplicated, although the UI makes it look like they are. So the previous two slides, this slide and the previous one, are an excellent illustration of my next recommendation, which in encouraging participation, which is to show your work. This was a tough one for our community, especially the museum professionals on the project team, especially me. There are trends toward open storage. If you've been to any of the museums where they let you walk back and see the open storage, maybe you've taken a behind-the-scenes tour. Although if you think that those aren't as heavily curated as the exhibitions, you're wrong. But in general, we do not let you walk through the exhibit while we are in the middle of installing it. And the thing that those wireframes and all of these comments have in common is that they are all screenshots from our wiki, our email list, and our issue tracker, all of which are publicly available resources. There are no secret groups, there are no hidden pages, there are no off-list conversations. Our drafts, activities, plans, priorities, roadmaps, everything is open for debate and comment. For many of our community members, and this really touches on something I think that Jenny talked about, this marks the first time that people were actively involved in the software development process, rather than being recipients of whatever solution IT passed along to them. We were delighted to discover that once we started asking questions about what people wanted and gave them a mechanism through which to contribute, we received a wealth of positive, useful feedback. I think I even wrote this one, so I'll pat myself on the back for my useful feedback. So my last recommendation is to get personal, and this is maybe even just another way of talking about mentorship. So here is an image of where museum collections professionals work. It is not the scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark where he's in the temple with like the golden thing. It's the scene from the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark when they're in the big warehouse full of crates. Like that's where we are. Collection staff are generally not the folks out front greeting people, taking the smiling children through the museum. We're the ones shivering in the climate-controlled storage room, wondering why anyone ever thought it was a good idea to acquire a box full of unidentified newspaper clippings. This translates, in many cases, to folks who are reluctant to participate in a public forum. They might feel like they have nothing to contribute. They don't want to air their organization's dirty laundry in public. They think that if they bring up issues that they have, that will reflect poorly on their organization. And they think that they don't know anything about software development, so how could they contribute? So we are lucky enough that throughout the course of this project, the Mellon, which is a Mellon-funded, we've had funding from the IMLS and from a few other sources, that there has always been funding for community outreach. So that means that rather than sit and wait for the quiet people to comment, we can just pick up the phone and call them, which has been a really surprisingly effective technique. So we call the people we want to get feedback from, and we ask them. We introduce ourselves. We say, here's an idea. What do you think? What would make your life easier? And in doing that, we do a couple of things. One, we build trust that we're not just a project that says we care what our community thinks, but only if you take the time to come and tell us about it. But we're a project that actively seeks out the opinions of the people who are using the software. And two, we build confidence. So what our users have to say and contribute is meaningful and useful to us. And then we have a phone conversation, somebody brings something up, that leads to a new feature in the next release or whatever. And then maybe the next time they feel confident enough to go ahead and participate in the public forum. We also send out introductions when new implementers come online, so everybody gets introduced, not just, oh, the Oakland Museum of California is adopting collection space, but the Oakland Museum of California is adopting collection space. We'd like you to meet Al and Becky, and they're the ones working there on this project. You know, why don't you say hi to them? So then the next time a museum comes along who sees a little bit of themselves in the Oakland Museum, they feel confident in reaching out, because they're not reaching out in the ether, they're not reaching out to somebody without a name, but then they feel like they can talk to Al and ask him, you know, how was it to implement collection space? So the flip side of all this, I started with the good and moved to the bad, is that obviously it's really labor intensive. At no point in the project's history have we been able to just sit back and watch the useful information roll in the door. In our community, there is still nervousness about adopting open source software. Will it be around in 5 or 10 years? What happens when the funding runs out? What's the sustainability plan? So to engage in these conversations with the community and then drop off the face of the earth gives weight to these concerns. So we can't sort of dip our toe into the community and then come back out and then go back in. It has to be this sustained, ongoing project. Because our install base, and so again, this is very specific to collection space, because our install base is still very small, we also still need to reach out to folks who do not use the software in order to ensure that we don't become an echo chamber, just getting answers from the same 20, 30, 40 people every time we do a new feature or a new roadmap. This can be a good thing, though. I mean, a good example of this is outreach that we do around these domain extension sets, which are specific additions to collection space that benefit a particular domain, like contemporary art or anthropology. So here's a screenshot. This is our just standard object ID information. You download collection space. This is what it looks like. And then this is what that same screen looks like at the University and Jepson Herbaria, which is at the University of California, Berkeley. So this is sort of small, and then you can see that they've hidden fields, they've changed names, they've added new groups that allow them to more accurately describe their collections. So you imagine it's fairly different if I'm describing that chair or if I'm describing a dried flower. So the work that they've done is very useful for other herbaria thinking about adopting collection space. So we took the work done at Berkeley, we put it up on the project wiki, and now we're reaching out to this international herbaria audience via conferences. The collection space program director is in Panama right now at an international herbaria conference. Maybe you didn't know they had them. They do in Panama. Mailing lists, personal contacts. So we want to know if what Berkeley has done is generally useful to the field. Do folks agree with the changes that they've made, the fields that they've added, the functionality they've created? would adding some of these changes as an extension set to the collection space core be generally useful for herbaria domain? Now, while of course we'd love for those who respond to our call for comment to eventually become collection space adopters, it's not a requirement for us to take their contributions seriously. So we need to have this really expansive view of the community. So again, we are all very fortunate to be grant funded in this. And again, one of the things that we're working on is actually to make my position as a funded position obsolete. So we are hoping to build the community and build the contributors enough such that it will take on this life of its own. So it will still be work, but hopefully at some point we will get to the point where it won't necessarily be paid work, although, right, maybe people just want to watch Downton Abbey. So we don't know. We'll see what happens in 2 years. Community building is not easy, nor is it ever work that you can just stick a fork in and say, we're done. But when you look at a successful project and you can point to the contribution of dozens or hundreds or thousands of people and say, they made this better, it's worth it. Thank you.
Megan, I'm going to ask you to flip your microphone on there too. You had a couple questions specific to yours. One came from Twitter from Anne-Marie Viola, I think, that collection space highlights the importance of transparency in open source development, active participants instead of just passive participants. Or passive recipients is actually what she said. How much is that transparency part still a struggle? Has time overcome that, or is it something that you think still needs active work, regardless of the age of the project?
I think on the part of the project team, everybody is on board. So people are, it is the culture of the project at this point, and people who come on board, that's what they're signing up for. As far as new software adopters are concerned, it is with each new one who comes on board, there's that element of getting them on board with transparency. And some are still very uncomfortable. So I will not name, well, I've already named Oakland, but that's fine because they're the good ones. They're the ones, they're out there. And so they're on the talk list and they have questions and they're sending them out to the community. And we have another new implementer that is a fine arts organization. And they're very old school. And they want their personal network, which is not the world. It's their personal network. It's the registrar's Rolodex, and that's who she feels comfortable calling. So I've spoken with her personally. I've put her in touch with other people who are implementing, but she's not yet comfortable asking them directly via some of our open channels, either via our issue tracker or our email list. And that's okay. I'm happy to be able to put her in touch with other people, and then hopefully it will snowball, or hopefully we'll get her even to subscribe to the talk list where she can lurk and see the other kinds of things that people are asking. So sometimes it is just setting up those connections, and then hopefully other people, by being good citizens in the community, will inspire others. But I think the culture of museums is such that it's still people have their Rolodexes and people have their secrets, and that will be an ongoing issue. That will work to, just by leading by example.
It sounds like the community of users is somewhat separated from the community of developers, or the code contributors. What strategies can you recommend for fostering dialogue directly between the two groups so that they speak and listen to each other, especially given that many of them might not always use the same jargon?
Sure. No, it's true. We have had developers on the project who were not affiliated in any way with an implementing institution. We've had developers, for example, at the University of California at Berkeley, where they were in the central IT department and then supporting the museums on campus. We've had freelancers. I think, we tend to spend a lot of time, and there are two C-Space developers here who might say too much time, but I think we generally try to pull the developers over onto the user side as much as possible. So we work very, very hard to get them involved in the domain and thinking about the domain. So this is not just a coding exercise, and they're not just trying to solve an interesting Java problem. They're trying to solve an interesting museum problem. And so I think that that's sort of the tack that we've taken, is really trying to pull the developers over a bit onto our side, onto the end user side. Because there can be that disconnect, and many, many museums do not have developers on staff. So they don't know how to talk to them, in a way that they might feel is productive. So, and then the one thing is the talk list. So we do have an open email list that both end users and developers contribute to fairly equally. And that's a nice way for them to see how the other group asks questions and how they answer questions. Oh, I didn't think that this might be a problem for them, but now that I think about it, so they're able to see that dialogue. We don't have, oh, well, here's the tech list and here's the end user list. It's, we try to keep people together as much as possible.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah,
Go for it.
I was just wondering. So the kind of people who would be using the software are kind of a specific community. It's not like. It's not even necessarily like something that's even necessarily patron facing, so something that like everyone would be using. So I'm kind of wondering, like, in terms of bringing people in and making people feel supported, how do you balance the like general open source ethos, like everyone's a part, with the fact that this is sort of a highly specialized kind of project that's looking for, in some ways, very specific kinds of contributions from people who are who are professionals in that field.
Right. No, that's, yes. People who do not use collections management software will probably not be super interested in this project. But I will say one thing, though, is that because collection space is web-based, which seems funny that you have to mention it, but that is still an abnormality in the collections management world, what we have actually done is try and reach out to a broader base in the museum. So normally you have a collections management system that's going to be the purview of the collections department, but because you're paying $5,000 a year for a site license, and so you're not going to let just everybody have one. But so one thing with collection space is that there's this real opportunity for other departments in the museum to get involved. The education department might say, wow, it would be super useful if. And so we can get those contributions from other people within the museum, because now there's this opportunity where they could get a login and they could have access to all this amazing collections information, and it would be read-only, and it would be, roles and permissions and whatnot. But so I think that that's what we've seen at a lot of the implementing institutions, is that it's expanded out and we get feedback. So when I did the implementation at Moving Image, we did have meetings with every other department to say, how could you be using this software and what's your feedback? But in terms of reaching out more broadly than that, I would say we haven't really done that. Good.
It's really interesting. Yeah, it's really cool.
No, it's a niche.
Yeah. No,
it's definitely a niche.
Laura Blanchard on Twitter summarized one of your statements. If you have a small user base, you need to reach out beyond your echo chamber to get feedbacks on bugs and features. And then Camille Brewer on the Discuss site asks kind of a question specifically to archive or to collection space, but I think is more broadly applicable as well. Do you think this software would be suitable for private art collectors or artists themselves? But then, in addition, could these other user communities contribute to the conversation? How do we bring in users, I guess, beyond what we traditionally think as the primary user base for the software?
Right. No, that's a super question. So the answer is yes, absolutely. Any kind of object would be perfectly appropriate for collection space. And that's a great question. No, I think that's a really good follow-up to Jenny's question. We haven't done outreach really outside the fairly traditional museum historical society, the institution, the building with things in it, whether physical or digital. So trying to reach out to artists, to private collectors, we'd welcome that. We'd love to get their feedback. It's not something that we've done yet. And I'm not sure where I would find them. So if somebody wants to, make some suggestions about where we would start to track those people down, that'd be great.
Specifically for you, but then also thinking about how projects position themselves to be attractive to others beyond, their mindset. I guess you have to twist your mind around what is it that we're doing and who else might find this useful.
Yep, definitely.
Okay, I think we're going to continue on. Our third presenter is not in the room with us. We're bringing her in from Oregon because she's been traveling a lot, but has a voice that we wanted to bring in. Aviva, are you there?
I am.
Excellent. All right. Aviva is the Director of Emerging Technologies and Services at Oregon State University Libraries and Press, where her work focuses on digital publishing, mobile, and open source tools development. She received a Master of Information Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park in 2006, and a Bachelor of Liberal Studies with a concentration in Middle Eastern and Modern American History from Boston University in 2000. With that, Aviva, please take it away.
All right, thanks. So I thought I would start today off with a little bit of an introduction to an open source project that OSU Libraries built and ultimately chose to abandon. And I'll walk us through why we abandoned the project and some of what we did before we chose to abandon the project and some of the mitigating factors that were existing at the time. And from there, I'll talk pretty briefly about what we do locally to encourage participation in open source communities throughout the library. And Jenny's presentation covered a lot of what we've done, but I just thought it might be useful to just... So with that, I'll start out by saying that back in 2005, the library conducted an extensive research project with students and found that the best place for the library to connect is when they have a class assignment to research and writing. So in 2006, we developed a custom open source content management system that we eventually called Library a la carte. And in Library a la carte, librarians could create small chunks of content that could be reused, shared, and edited. Modules could contain various kinds of content and, for example, book titles from the online catalog, links to subscription article databases, selected websites, or instructions on how to conduct research. And other types of librarians include instructional videos, specialized search boxes, images, user comments, polls, and quizzes. And so the students had a way to get additional help. Each of the web pages includes contact information for the librarian who authored the page. Contact modules could also incorporate a chat box. So if what I've just described to you sounds relatively familiar, it should. LibGuides is the same basic concept, and it was released about 6 weeks after Library a la carte was on the market. They are not an open source tool, and this was. So I mentioned, Library a la carte was a free and open software, source software that could be redistributed or modified under the terms of the GNU Affero General Public License. The software was developed using Ruby on Rails and had a MySQL database. So interest in Library a la carte from other libraries looking for a similar solution really exceeded our expectations. There were hundreds of downloads of a la carte and over 1,000 accounts registered on the demonstration version of the software. The online user community was strong, and hundreds of suggestions, fixes, and ideas came from the community back to our developer. Now, what I may not have made clear is that our faculty had approached the university librarian to take a vacant librarian position, and instead of hiring a new librarian, used the open position to hire one developer who would build and take care of Library a la carte for the entire community. Now, other than our digital applications librarian who took care of our DAMs and our institutional repository, she was our only developer on staff. Now, because libraries are not primarily in the business of software development, we don't tend to have a tremendous amount of experience building development communities. So while the tenets of open source software align with the sharing mindset of librarianship, most libraries don't have the resources in place to support a large-scale software development project like a la carte from cradle to grave on their own, especially not if they have hopes of exploring other newer technologies while continuing to support the older legacy tools. What happened with us? So over the lifetime of the project, the library had come to realize that the level of staffing devoted to this project was not enough to provide the support and effort needed to expand not just the capabilities of Library a la carte, but our library's capacity for exploration and innovation into other tools and technologies that were showing up on the landscape. So about 5 years after the project went live, we tried to find a way to turn Library a la carte from having a single developer who made all of the modifications, updates, bug fixes, etc., to the project and move it to a true shared community-driven project who would keep the tool alive. So we approached this challenge in two ways. First, we wanted to set in place a way to broaden the pool of adopters. We felt that it was necessary to offer the software as a hosted or cloud-based solution. And to determine the feasibility of doing so, we ended up running tests on a la carte in the cloud using both Heroku and Amazon Web Services. And the second way that we ended up approaching this challenge of adoption and staffing was to try to leverage support from the existing group of users to build a robust and supportive developer community. So we ran tests of a la carte in the cloud. The first cloud-based test was with a partner institution using the Heroku platform, and the second consisted of mounting a copy of our library's a la carte environment onto AWS. The primary reason that we did for conducting these tests were to ascertain if there would be any issue with configuration, installation, or functionality in those environments, develop a cost model based on. So we chose Heroku for the first test implementation because it's a platform as a service for applications that use Ruby on Rails, and frankly, because based on our low-scale production expectations, it would be free. So initial evaluation of the pilot was quite positive and the software seemed to be working properly, but problems started to arise when the administrators tried to add new users to the system. Other problems arose that were not as easy to troubleshoot, leaving us with too few pages created and too little traffic going to those pages to provide enough feedback to set a cost structure. So we ultimately considered that test to be a failure. Why we moved on to the second cloud test, which we conducted in 2 phases. The phase 1 test configuration and functionality of a la carte on AWS, and it was designed to outline what it would take to set up a copy of our production installation of a la carte on the cloud, testing all major functions and making sure everything worked exactly the way it would in a local installation. Experienced only one minor issue with we're sort of set to go from there. So we ran that test for about 2 weeks beginning in early January of 2012, and 10 of our librarians participated in the test, all of whom were familiar with the software and knew how it should work. Each participant performed 12 tasks they would normally do when creating, editing, and sharing a la carte pages, and the testers found that the software performed as well on the cloud as it does on the local server. Now, what I should point out, though, is that this was our instance and our installation that we had modified for our use and not the base code version that we were distributing and that we had done originally in that first. Now, for the phase 2 test, we actually put our production version of a la carte running on AWS for one term. We got real-time information to compute units and how much storage it took to run the a la carte program at what we consider to be a medium-sized university library. And from this information, we were able to create a cost structure for running library a la carte and found it to be quite affordable, all things considered. The cost was comparable to purchasing a 5-year replacement cycle. So now, most cultural heritage institutions don't have a tremendous amount of experience building software, creating governance or engaging in open source. And to be perfectly frank, this project started almost 10 years ago when open source wasn't as ubiquitous a term as it is now in our communities. So for us, toughest piece of the puzzle was trying to actually build a developer community. We had a relatively active user community, as I said, but building a developer community after the fact proved to be a little bit too difficult for us. So in The Cathedral and the Bazaar, Eric Raymond describes various stages of open source software development, one of which is the incubation period, where the initial creators of the software have worked to get something off the ground. Time period when you reach out and find new developers to join your community, when you're the shiny new kid on the block offering something kind of awesome. But at the point that we were trying to build a developer community, we had gone well past the incubation period. And it was really hard at that point. You know, the project was really well established, and it was really hard for us to hide the fact that an eminently affordable, off-the-shelf solution that we were competing against. Now, that said, I went ahead and outlined a 12-month plan to build a community, after which point, if we weren't successful, we would abandon future support of a la carte and migrate to libguides. We outlined a plan to move from all modifications to the base, sharing it back to the community, a meritocratic model where positive contributions make consensus decisions about development. We wrote papers, organized a pre-conference at Code for Lib, and presented at a number of international conferences. And we also reached out to our user community and asked for help. And during this time, we hired a new developer to help with outreach and community building. But frankly, all of these efforts failed for two very important reasons. One, we didn't have the staff necessary to make the outreach and community building work. We needed someone who was going to spend a portion of their time in existing open source communities and pushing members of our user community to get their technical staff to work collectively with us. We didn't have the FTE, had other competing priorities, and we didn't have a marketing plan in place. Now, as I said before, it is also, so number two, as I said before, it is really, really hard once you've established a project to build a community after the fact. You really need to be thinking about building your community as you're building your tool. So for us, Library a la carte was an open source product that was at its tipping point. For us, really depended on building a community interested in enhancing the existing tool and expanding its capabilities to meet our users' needs. So when Library a la carte was first conceptualized, the idea was to create something to improve access and to push library content out to users. We're very successful in that regard. We created a stable, well-used tool that met user standards. It was also started at a time when there weren't terrific tools for sharing and versioning code with open communities. So we had posted our code in the Ruby Forge community, but there were not a lot of libraries and cultural heritage institutions that had staff building and deploying open source tools within that community. So where we may not have served us well, it may not have served us as well as that we had hoped it would. And just because it should be stated clearly, it was also built at a time when many cultural heritage institutions were not actively engaging in open source development, especially compared to how they are now. So in the case of a la carte, there was also another product on the market that offered similar capabilities, that had strong outreach and advertising arm, that didn't require a developer or a system, ran on the cloud, and that was relatively inexpensive, but frankly was less staffing necessary to run. So unfortunately, because we were unsuccessful in building a developer community, and our internal estimates on how long it would take to fix all of the issues that had come up in the intervening years, including migrating to a newer version of Ruby, we decided to abandon our work on the project. So at that point, I reached out again to the institutions that we knew were adopters of the tool, and ended up having 4 or 5 institutions approach us and say that it was a terrific tool. They had continued doing tons of work and would be happy to share it back with the community. We just never heard their voice before that point. Nub Games ended up coming up and taking over support of the project, and many of the institutions who had initially adopted a la carte continue to use it to this day. But unfortunately for OSU, it was too late. We had already reallocated our resources into other projects and ended up choosing to walk away. So in case it isn't clear, OSU has a history of working with and building open source tools. Just because we were discontinuing development and use of a la carte didn't mean that we were going to stop building open source tools. So what we did instead was change the way that we approach development of new projects. So small projects, or things that we like creating an open source room reservation system or a mobile optimized tour of all of the artwork on our campus, to be built in-house code shared with GitHub. We set up regular checks for the software that we develop, put it on a refresh cycle where we would also review other tools in the marketplace to make sure continuing to support the tool as it currently existed makes the most sense financially and intellectually for the future of our institution. Larger projects, however, would either start out as a partnership with a plan for building developing communities alongside the actual start of the project, or we would participate in established or growing open source communities. So we also began actively working with various stakeholders around the library for engagement in the open source we have engaged. So in May 2013, we crafted an open source development guideline that codified what we had been doing all along, building tools in public venues, using open source tools, and releasing code with CC BY licensing. This one thing on its shift my staff from the idea of just putting code out there in the ether for folks to use or not as they saw fit, to providing them with a mandate to act in open source communities. And that participation was part of their job and not just something that maybe they had to do or maybe they wanted to do on their own time. So earlier that academic year, in collaboration with the University of Oregon, we began exploring options for a new digital asset management system. Now, we ultimately chose to move forward with Hydra, and for us, contributing back to the Hydra community was a major factor in our decision to adopt, but more than that, it also provided us with an opportunity to engage with the Fedora community as well. Engaging into active open source communities was really exciting for us and ties into our interest in innovation, community participation, and actively engaging in building the future of libraries. Our faculty and staff find that engagement in these communities is not only intellectually and socially stimulating, but a real point of pride for them. And our engagement with these communities has frankly been a really powerful recruiting tool as well. But what we learned from our experiences with a la carte was that a healthy project has not just a strong developer, but a strong and active user community as well. You need to make sure that your communities don't just appeal to developers, but to other stakeholders within your organization as well. With communities, though, this kind of holistic participation can be difficult to begin, and not every stakeholder will be comfortable jumping in feet first. Many people are concerned about potentially embarrassing themselves in a public forum or in front of their library heroes, and many of your technical and non-technical participants may not understand the tools and the rules of engagement. Now, if you've ever heard me talk, you've probably heard me talk about the importance of training and mentorship, and Jenny also talked about this. But, engaging in open source communities is no different. It also needs training. It also needs mentorship. Using a revision control and source code management tool is not necessarily intuitive to all users. Not everyone has heard of, let alone used IRC. And lots of people who want to participate in these kinds of communities don't know how to get started, where to get more information, what kinds of things are needed, or even where to find out more information. So it's important when promoting engagement at your home institution to encourage all interested participants to find ways of engaging. Projects need all sorts of non-coding work like translation, design, copywriting, documentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you want real adoption and ownership, you need to have broad engagement. So I think I've made my case that finding out how to engage isn't always easy, and that the idea for some people of jumping into an unknown community can be daunting. And for some, even outside of the potential professional embarrassment, there could be a real social, cultural risk if a misstep is made. So one of the things that we've tried to do at OSU is to walk contributors through how to participate in communities. Now, we've had a lot of success with our student developers, but the faculty that we work with who have participated in these trainings have found real benefit and increased comfort with the idea of participating, whether it's joining a user group call, showing them how to get onto an IRC channel, or how to use GitHub. Now, there is a real value in providing short-term, high-touch support and training for those interested in the open source projects in which you participate, because it ensures engagement, mitigates the fear factor, and it provides new voices for your project. So I think I'll leave off there for now, but I look forward to our continuing conversation through our discussion. But before I go, I would also like to say that, like Jenny, open source is the community that I was always looking to be a part of, despite the fact that I am an administrator and not a developer, nor do I listen to techno while coding Ruby all night long, and I too prefer reading a book rather than attending a hackathon. So thanks.
Thanks. We've had a couple of people commenting on Twitter where what you're saying has been resonating with them. It's hard to build an open source developer community after the fact. Build your community while you're building your tool, otherwise ... And perhaps you provided one illustration of what happens there, and certainly how you've learned from that. You mentioned a word that I don't think either Jenny or Megan mentioned, and that was marketing. Can you talk a little bit more about the role of marketing and I guess it's marketing yourself as a project and marketing yourself as a product, and maybe how do those intersect?
So I think that, that one of the things that libraries are not very good at is actually promoting their services and promoting their tools to a variety of communities. We tend to, I think often we build tools that are with a very specific idea or a very specific user group in mind, and we're not always thinking about how other groups could use this tool to their benefit. I think for me, the other piece is that, Jenny mentioned this earlier, the sort of swag idea, is that you don't tend to see projects with tables at large conferences. You may see an Islandora table or a Hydra table at a conference like Code for Lib, where it's a community of people that know about it already. But you wouldn't, for example, see the Hydra project or the Islandora project at a table at SCHOSS, where you might be in a position to start talking about building institutional repositories or building campus-wide DAM solutions. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that the way that we're approaching building these tools is about working collectively to build those tools, but benefiting your home institution and your home needs. And we don't have a lot of vendors in the marketplace who are building those tools for those communities. I also think, again, it comes down to one of the things that I think that we will always sort of struggle with when you're talking about competing against vendors who are paid vendors with a for-profit tool is that they have the money in place to be able to hire marketing staff whose job it is to go out and to support various conferences, to attend conferences, to present at conferences, to hand out that swag. And I think that there is, I think one of the things that we as a community really need to think about is how we want to sell the tools that we're building and making it not just about you're part of a community and you have more control, but really about what is it that we're doing and what is the world that we're building together, and what does your contribution to this look like, and that your contribution is not just about code, but it could also be about, marketing or anything else that you want to bring to a project. I'm not sure if that really answered your question, though.
Yeah. We're moving into the kind of the panel discussion, so would invite you, Jenny and Megan, to chime in as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'd really like to second that, Aviva. I think that's, I think that's been kind of, that's pretty, it's pretty self-evident. Even just in terms of ethos, one thing, in my own work, so I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I write a newsletter with several 17-year-old boys in Europe. And this is our community's newsletter. It goes to over 70,000 people, which actually in terms of nonprofit marketing is actually considered a fairly small newsletter, which I was very surprised to hear. But that being said, like, I write it, I don't come from a marketing background particularly, but this is the job that I have on the team. And two of the people I work with are not native English speakers. And this goes to 70,000 people, and it's an ethos thing for us. This is a community contributor-led newsletter. For other places, this might not be, people would be concerned about the quality of this. I will say that we've gotten out a very high-quality newsletter consistently for the last 2 years. I mean, even from before I was there. And it may not be always, it may not have all of the metrics. It may not have all of the fancy marketing lingo speak that people put into newsletters. I mean, we also are a community that's trying to educate each other. Like, we send each other articles about how to make this newsletter better, research from the field. And so it's not something, it really just has a much more organic and kind of friendly feel to it. But yeah, I mean, I think that would be something that would be completely antithetical to a lot of larger, or even just not open or not open source companies or corporations that are working with that. I mean, I can't imagine that happening really anywhere else.
Aviva, as we move into the kind of the panel discussion format, I'm going to, you're at a disadvantage because I don't have a line of eyesight with you, so I invite you and give you permission and even insist that you interrupt during the pauses so that we hear from you as well. On Twitter, am I hearing right that there might be a place for marketers on an open source team?
Absolutely.
Absolutely?
I think so too. And I think that marketing in a lot of ways can be, Jenny's newsletter is a great example, but, one of the great things about Twitter is that it exists and that it's a great marketing tool in and of itself. Marketing can also be about creating, postcards and logos and things like that, user interfaces. All of that work that you're doing is really about trying to find out ways that you can engage and encourage your community to engage back with you. And I do think that there is a role for marketing and for promotional activities within open source communities. And I think, frankly, interest to be thinking that way because the corporations are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How is our marketing different? I guess maybe we've already talked about that a little bit, that we're marketing not only the features of the software, the features of the project, but we're marketing the philosophy of the project as well. Is that a burden that we share? Is that something that each community and each project needs to tailor to its own specific audience?
Well, I just got back from a conference last week, and I told my husband that sometimes I felt like Santa Claus from Miracle on 34th Street, where he sends people to other stores. So people come to Macy's to look for something, and then he says, well, we don't have it at Macy's. You go, or he's at Gimbel's or whatever it is. And so in that way, I'm a terrible salesperson because people might come to talk to me about collection space, and sometimes I will say, well, actually, you should probably be using this completely different, you should be using archive space, or you should be using Past Perfect, or, some other thing. So that, for me, it's interesting being in this community outreach role, and where's the line between being a salesperson and doing marketing and advertising and doing outreach. And so that's, this is a new position for collection space. This is not a role we've had previously. So it's interesting to sort of feel my way through that. Where do I draw the lines? You know, I don't want to sell somebody something that they don't need. I want people to adopt collection space because it's right for their institution, because they want to be involved in open source, because they need the application for their museum or what have you. So it is interesting, but then I worry about things like, do we have good name recognition? So it's how to, you know, it's an interesting balance for me, and I'm still on that teeter-totter of, you know, not trying to glad hand people when I see them, but trying to let people know, you know, who we are and what we're about.
I also really want to emphasize that community building is not marketing. That creating communities and supporting communities that have impact is not the same as marketing. And I think that sometimes that there's a little bit of like, you know, even if you look at job descriptions for community management in various, particularly in startups, which it's become kind of like a buzzword. We're looking for a community manager who has 10 years of marketing experience. So to be a subject expert on how to build a community, how to develop a community, well, what I've been using the phrase communities of practice, which comes from a really amazing book that I have with me, and by Etienne Wegner. So the idea of a community of practice is sort of a slightly more loose-knit group of people who come together around a specific topic. Sorry. But that being said, I think that thinking about projects in terms of lots of different kinds of contributions and functional areas, marketing is definitely something that can really benefit a project to know. I mean, I can really speak largely from the Mozilla point of view. I mean, we have a marketing team. There are ways to get involved with that team as a contributor, for sure. We call it community engagement. But community engagement is different from community building. I am on community building. And while we have a lot of overlap and sit kind of largely on the same team now, although we didn't used to, it is not the same thing. And I think that one of the things about marketing is that when you start is that in open source, we don't see each potential contributor, each potential person who wants to work with us as a dollar sign. That's not how it works. And I really think that thinking about it in a more organic way and not seeing the people who are going to work on our projects with us as dollar signs, as money that we can make, while keeping in mind that, you know, this is, you know, if one is, anyway.
The effort has to sustain itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
That the effort has to sustain itself. That we really can open up marketing as a definite way to get involved.
Both of you made it sound more like a conversation. It's marketing, I guess, being not a marketer, and I might offend some, is about selling a point of view, is about convincing a point of view. And what we're really talking about is a conversation between the project and the adopters of a project. Does this make sense for you? How do you see your commitment, and so forth?
And I also think, Peter, that it's important to say that marketing is not about sales. It's not the same thing as sales. What you're doing with marketing is trying to show people what the benefits are of the tool that you're presenting, the community that you're showcasing. And I think that there is that it's really easy for us to get the two conflated, but there is a real difference between those two ideas.
Switching gears, maybe. What is the most? So we've talked a little bit about what projects can do to attract or retain community members. What's the most important thing not to do?
I guess from my perspective, the most important thing not to do is to not be a jerk. I I frankly think that is the sort of baseline. Don't be a jerk. I guess the other thing is that I think it's important for any project to not necessarily turn their nose up at somebody who is coming at them with something that maybe the original group working on it, or that the group, the community that exists hadn't thought about, and at least to be open to exploring or hearing alternative ideas or new ideas.
We like to call that like innovating from the edges. Like that's one of the beauties of open source, is that it really allows for innovation from the edges, that people can come at you with the craziest idea and you think like, this is not answering your question, and you think like, one of the people on my team who I work with always gives the example of getting an email many years ago from a chef in Vietnam who wanted to know how he could help Mozilla, and trying to find a space for somebody who has that capability, who has that talent, to help Mozilla. And I don't actually know the end of the story. I don't know if if he did find a way to get involved, but basically this is to say that there are tons and tons of different ways to get involved. And I have to agree with Aviva, like baseline, like be welcoming to new people. Don't be a jerk. And sometimes there's this there's a really great thread on the Wikipedia mailing list recently about the different kinds of hostility to people who are coming into open source, and how you very rarely see, you do sometimes, you do see kind of out and out hostility, but more often than not, you see this kind of like, there was a word for it, but it's like this kind of ignoring hostility, where somebody throws something out and then it's like radio silence. Even somebody sometimes within the community will throw out a concept or an idea, or even say something, and there would just be radio silence on the other end, and people continue kind of doing their thing, what they're doing. And I think that's kind of baseline. The other really, the other thing that is a very important thing not to do is not recognizing contributors in a way that feels meaningful to them. So an example that we give frequently is, the first time you get a t-shirt, awesome. The second time you get a t-shirt, maybe still awesome. The third time you get a t-shirt, maybe you might want to think about asking me what else I might like, unless I really like t-shirts. But like, there's definitely like the rule of diminishing returns there. Like, I want to stay in a community because I feel supported, and because I feel welcomed, and because I feel recognized. And to continue, doing the same recognition, if that's like a call out on a website or a t-shirt or, I don't know, a pen, that's fine at some level, but then at some point, recognition really becomes something that needs to be an ongoing process.
Well, that sounds scarily like a customer relationship management system for an open source community.
There are actually open source.
There are, yes.
And then I would say, I touched on this a little bit when I spoke, but trying to maintain that consistency of contact and engagement. So, a lot of us operate on grant cycles, and you're funded to talk to people, and then the funding goes away and you stop talking to them. And then people get confused. Is the project still happening? What happened? And so, we've seen that, we've had there were boom and bust years. And that led to confusion. So maintaining some sort of baseline of outreach and communication, even to let people know our funding cycle is out and we'll be refunded in 6 months, so you might not hear from us much,
Right.
Even something like that. But it can cause a lot of confusion, concern, if you don't keep up. Once you've gotten people engaged, you need to keep that going, because they won't necessarily. They have their jobs to do. their job is not community outreach for your project. So.
Go ahead, Aviva.
No, that's fine. I was interrupting Megan. I think, we actually experienced that when our developer left and we had about a year or so of not having a developer in place for the library a la carte project. We did communicate with our community, but I remember going to conferences and having people say to me, so is that still happening? And it's a tough thing to do, right? Because you have hired somebody to do it, and it is hard, I think, at some point to kind of push that back onto the community.
Also in the category of things not to do, Blake Carver says enforce a no jerks policy for your project. And I think we've seen this welcome wave of codes of conduct for conferences. Do we see the same wave of codes of conduct for projects? And should we?
So kind of going beyond a no jerks policy, just to be a little serious for a minute, I'd really take a look at the work of Ash Dryden around codes of conduct, if you're interested in that. She's been doing a lot of really wonderful work, and also is having a series of kind of talks about diversity in tech 2.0. So it's a little bit, it's not like the basic talks. You'll get kind of more integrated talks. The first session was in Boston a couple weeks ago. It was awesome, and they're going to be happening all over the country this year. So in terms of codes of conduct for projects, yes and no. I think in her talk on how to find an open source project to contribute to, Shauna Gordon McCone, whose name I can pronounce, she's the project manager at OpenHatch, and she does a lot of, first of all, she gives a super fascinating blog, and she also does a lot of fantastic work around codes of conduct, and one of the first things that she says to look for, and I think also you wrote an article about, does the community that you're thinking of contributing to or working with have a code of conduct? This is a first question to ask, because even if it's not always followed, it means that the intentionality is there. And the code of conduct that's there should also have a way of dealing with conflict, of dealing with potential conflicts that may arise. Expect the worst, hope for the best kind of situation. But things, I think that many projects are moving toward adopting codes of conduct, but not enough. I mean, I don't think it'll ever be enough.
I'm really going to shift gears here, I think. This is a question on from the Discuss site from Sharon Clapp. Is there an inherent value in the deployment of open source, or should the individual organization or individual project's needs be the primary rationale for the solution choice, whether it's open sourced or closed source? And then she has some follow-ups from there, but maybe we'll start there.
So as an administrator, I will say that I think it's important whenever you're deciding to adopt a tool that you keep an open mind about what your needs are institutionally before you make a decision about any tool, whether or not it's open source or closed source or purchased from a vendor or built in-house. And I think that there are a lot of pieces that go into making those decisions. You need to consider the needs of the variety of communities that you're working with, but you also need to consider the short-term and the long-term costs associated with it. You have to be comfortable with what contributing to an open source community will cost you versus the cost of purchasing a closed source solution. And I know, Peter, you have worked really hard on creating a number of tools that can help people make decisions about what is the right tool to use for a particular organization. And I think from my perspective, again, as an administrator, I think it's really, really important to constantly be thinking about what is that balance and not just saying we're going to engage in an open source community because we like open source communities and not thinking about what the needs are for you, your institution, and your project.
So she goes on to say, is the need for open source so great in this community that the leading members of the community, the best funded libraries or those with developers on staff, should step forward and get congratulations for their use of open source software, even if the results are imperfect? Should the long-term good of developing open source development skills that are helpful to the whole community outweigh the quick benefits of deploying a pre-made proprietary package? That's really getting into what I see is the issue of the lone developer, someone who has a real interest in a package, has a real drive to contributing to the community, versus structures that have developers that are paid on staff, that work on that do nothing but work on an open source project for their own good and then for the benefit of the community. Can these two coexist? How do these two coexist? The community of lone developers and the all-in-one house style. We've seen both. We see both examples. We see kind of the quali-ole model where there is that large institutional commitment, and then we see a model like Evergreen and Koha where the commitment is considerably more diverse. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that question.
And that's why the discussion site is there. So those that are reading Sharon's question and have input, please do so.
I mean, I would argue that anyone who's ever worked in a library knows that most software solutions, proprietary or open source, are imperfect and do not really fit all the needs. But as Megan spoke about collection space, at least in the open source development cycle, there's a way to get those features that you want into the program. There's a mechanism in which to talk to the people who are doing this active development. And there's a way to actually have your voice heard in a meaningful way. But I think that sometimes people don't know that open source, that putting in an open source system can be a lot more work than necessarily getting software as a service out of the box. That being said, none of these solutions are going to be perfect, and I mean, I can just speak anecdotally also. I worked in a library that used a piece of software that was no longer supported by the vendor. And so when we had a problem, we had absolutely no recourse. We just had to buy the new version eventually, but couldn't afford it yet. So, I mean, no solution's going to be perfect, but I would argue that to kind of pit the two against each other is not necessarily the most productive way to think about it.
There's a thread of discussioning happening back on the marketing topic. Marketing open source like a closed source project will result in users expecting the same kind of service from a closed source vendor. The trick is to finding a marketing strategy that gets the word out but also educates the user about open source. And then following up, agreed. I would argue that the product you are marketing isn't a project; it's a community. That should inform the honing of your marketing message. Are we marketing communities? Are we selling communities? Are we? What role does that? We keep coming back around to this. What role does talking about the community have in how we present the forward-facing view of our projects?
No, I mean, it's interesting, and to go back to Sharon's question from the discussion site, we use collection spaces. At the end of the day, you have to be able to manage your collection. So there is a software application and it has to work. But we all work in museums and libraries. We could all be making huge amounts of money in the private sector, and we're not. We're all in this field because we're martyrs or we're altruists or whatever it is. However you want to describe yourself today. So the community, that's a very valid selling point or marketing point or outreach point, that it's about more. I could be working in a corporate archives, taking care of the records of, Coca-Cola or whatever, and I'm not. I'm in a nonprofit. This is the setting them in. So community is important, and that is a selling point. That it is more than just software. So the software has to work, but the ability to contribute to something more than is important. There was a question about getting people to contribute who aren't even involved in the project and who don't even use the software, and it's because people like to people like to talk. People like it when you ask them questions, and they like to talk about what they do, and so I think that's important. Having that forum and having that outlet adds to the value of that software that you're developing to that project.
So Douglas Atkin, who I mentioned in my talk, has this drawing which has been really helpful for us in our own community building efforts, called the commitment curve. We really love, I in particular, I'm super guilty of making a flow chart or diagram out of absolutely every piece of information presented to me. But two things that we've worked on. So we have this sort of circular model of the different kinds of contributors to our project. So it starts on the outside with user, and then there are casual contributors, and there are supporters, and there are users, casual contributors, and then something in the middle that I'm blanking on, and core contributors right at the middle. And there are definitely metrics that we can put on that, like how many people are core, how many people are casual contributors, how many people are users, and it shrinks. But one of the things that the commitment curve does that I found really useful is it helps you kind of think about the life cycle of your community, and how people get involved and how they contribute and how they feel supported, and whether it can go up or whether it can go like that. There are similar graphs in the book I mentioned, Cultivating Communities Practice, about how enthusiasm rises and then levels off and then maybe shrinks, but at the end of the day you're dealing with humans. I might get really busy for a while. I'll just use my newsletter example again. One of the people I work with on the newsletter had been really quiet on the channel for several weeks, and I got really nervous. I thought he was mad at me for some reason, and it turned out that his grandpa died. And he came back 2 weeks later and said, "I'm really sorry, my grandpa died, so I haven't been around, but I'm really excited to start contributing again." But these individual interactions are kind of what makes it. It's what makes it important, and it's what makes these, and it's what keeps me in the community. I don't feel particularly connected to things I just use necessarily. You know, one of the first questions you get asked if you've ever interviewed for a marketing job is, what brands do you really love? And I think some people feel a lot of love and commitment to brands. Some people don't. And yeah, but I do think that, like, once you're a part of something, once you're a part of a community, once you're contributing to a project, you start to feel a kind of commitment and ownership of that project that you don't necessarily feel, or you probably don't feel, with almost any other thing. You know, you're not a user, you're a contributor, and that's different, and that's really special.
I like that. You're a user of the software, but you're committed to the community. That's where your commitment lies. Speaking of silence on channel, which you did, Aviva, I just want to check in to make sure you're there.
I am.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So, you know, we talked a little bit about the commercialization of proprietary systems and so forth, and we have commercial organizations that straddle these boundaries, that commercial support providers that are supporting, are developing, have clients hosted, do consulting with open source software. Do we have expectations of what the role of the commercial provider should be in encouraging their customers to join the community? Is that best as a hands-off relationship? No, we're taking care of you. You don't need to join the community. Or should the commercial provider introduce their customers to the community?
Yes.
So I think that if you are trying to build, if you are a vendor working in a space where you are leading and to an open source community, but you're a for-profit group, I think part of your mission should be about getting the people that hire you as a vendor to be engaged in the community that you're helping to create, that you are contributing to, even as a for-profit institution.
So are there structures or are there techniques that we can use that enable that space to occur, that allows for that space for those commercial providers to sell their services, but also be part of the community? Are there, and maybe we know of some within the cultural heritage community, Equinox and Bywater and others. Are there other examples outside the cultural heritage community where we can look for good suggestions to bring in those commercial providers and their customers?
I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, I'd have to get back to you. I'm not sure.
Okay. I think of I wonder if I think of some of the big ones like Red Hat, and I wonder, does Red Hat, as the leading provider of commercial Linux operations, do they invite their customers to be part of the Red Hat community, or is it really just Red Hat is selling something, but on the other half of it, it's giving part of its development to the Red Hat, to that Linux community? I think IBM is another one in there, and of course these are all huge, monstrous companies that don't scale well. But I sometimes wonder how that scales down to us.
I believe that they do. I know that Red Hat has some of the most, incredible community advocates working with them. And yeah, I believe that they do invite in the community. I'm not sure how. I'd have to look that up and get back to you.
Yeah. Might be worth us collectively exploring. Question for Megan and Aviva, as leaders in an open source package. If you had a chance to sit down with an organization that was considering adopting your package, what would you want them to understand about your community? And then consequently, what would you ask of them if they did decide to adopt the software?
So we've, when we've sat down with people and when I meet people out in the world, we generally just ask that they not view it, and I think this plays well with what Jenny said earlier about, brand, people being into a brand, that they not just treat it as another piece of software that their IT department has installed, that they just interact with the software and they complain about it after hours and, whatever it is. But that the idea that if you want to adopt this, then you have it in your power to improve it. And the way that you do that is by contributing and by participating. And so, we try and stress that it's not something that you have to do. You can download the software and we don't require you to log in or register, and you can download and never talk to us and never ask a question, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. But there's the opportunity to help others. There's the opportunity to help yourself. There's the opportunity to make connections. Oh, I wish we had this thing. You talk to me, I'll tell you that somebody else wants it too. Why don't we get together and, have a show? So we stress that very heavily when we talk to people in person, that they don't have to contribute and they don't have to join the community, but there are huge benefits to doing so, both for themselves and for everybody else, the rising tide.
I think our experience with the Hydra community has been very similar to what Megan is describing, and I think that for a la carte, a little bit different scenario. That particular project really had, one person responsible for it. It didn't have any kind of community behind it to provide necessary support, and I think what I probably would have said was, you have the option of taking what we've done and just, base code and going from there, but you have the option of customizing it and using it to meet your needs more effectively. But I said it in my presentation, but I think that the sort of ultimate, I don't want to say failing, but the ultimate piece that really brought that project down was that there wasn't a community around it. And I think that one of the things that that open source really does give you is an opportunity to find people who have similar ideas, or have similar needs, and work to basically customize the software to work best for you. And you never know. I mean, your crazy idea may actually resonate with the 100 other adopters.
Mm-hmm. Again, I want to encourage anyone that has questions to put them in the Discuss site, or if they're short enough, to put them on Twitter with the SCHOSS hashtag. One that came in from Twitter a while ago, and this is changing gears again, is should today's MILS programs incorporate OSS tools like GitHub into their curriculums? And we might be preaching to the choir to say that yes, they should, and we can maybe debate that. But maybe we can turn this question into how and when should library schools introduce students to these kinds of tools.
So
Peter, I would actually.
No, go ahead, Aviva.
Thanks. So I would actually say that that I think that we should, but we should also consider that tools like GitHub are not just useful for development, they're also really useful for researchers to basically help them with version control, to help them with their research. And so if you sell it as something like a data management tool as part of a data management course, and you talk about it in a different kind of context, you're teaching a basic skill set as opposed to teaching about a tool for a specific. Also, from my perspective, and this actually came up at the IFLA conference, there were a lot of people that were talking about how across the globe, regardless of the sort of technical expertise, that we are doing all of our library students a disservice by not giving them access to or information about experience with technologies like open source development, open source communities, and the environments that exist there, because it is becoming more and more important in the library community. And and Jenny had that great statistic about the number one thing that library school grads want to know is how to program.
So I'll speak as someone who probably most recently finished my library degree in the room. And I would hasten to say that library schools, because of slow changes in curriculum development, because of a lot of reasons, are pretty woefully behind. But I also will say that not every librarian wants to be a programmer. And one of the first things you notice when you're in library school is that you're sitting in your core classes with a lot of children's librarians who are looking to do programming of a different sort,
Yes.
And I think that's really important to keep in mind. I will say that just kind of two slightly more anecdotal things is that last fall, when Python for Librarians was taught at UNC, it was perhaps the most popular class that was offered that semester. And also, I took a bunch of Girl Develop It classes, which is a sort of a woman place to learn coding for women. And of the 10 participants, 9 of us had all either graduated from or were in UNC SILs together. And this to me, and then I think about my own coursework, and there's definitely more technical classes you can take, and I actually was encouraged by several professors to take classes in the computer science department. You can do that. But I do think that there needs to be a lot more support within library school, information science school curriculum that is more specifically geared, if this is what people are asking for, it's more specifically geared toward programming and is also sort of a lot faster developed. I'm actually thinking of, so at Software Carpentry, one thing we say is, we teach Git, but what we're really teaching is version control. And so there's this idea that, we're just teaching tools, we're just teaching the language that's in style right now. But actually, there are ways to teach programming, to teach to teach computer skills that are not just teaching tools. Like I happened to be in a databases class that taught me full-on database design from top to bottom, using SQLite. It was the hardest class I've ever taken, and also one of the most useful. Whereas the other databases class at UNC that year learned how to use Access. And I don't think that necessarily teaching students how to use Access in a databases class is going to set people up for long-term success and how to actually learn databases. While my class was impossibly hard, and I definitely envied them while I was in it, at the same time, I really think that we should be thinking about how can we set people up for long-term success as data managers. The most common word that appeared in jobs in libraries last year was data. And I don't feel like library schools are currently equipped to deal with this new set of people who are often data managers. Just for a little bit of context, this is partially what I wrote my master's paper on, so that's why I know a little bit about it.
Another perspective on that, one of our, well, oldest is not the right way to say it, one of our earliest contributors to the project started as a library student at UT Austin, where they installed collection space, or its precursor, for their class. And so it was a nice way to get people involved, because you had people in the class, and this is the UT Austin Library School, so you had people in the class who did have programming skills, and they worked on installation and configuration, and then you had people who were more interested in content, and they curated an exhibit or wrote cataloging records. So you had people interacting with the software at all levels, but in one class in library school. And then he was hired on, on the project, because of his work on that. But I think there's a real, and something that we've talked about with a couple different professors, is the idea of being able to use collection space in class as a tool. And then you get people who code and people who don't code, but all of whom are capable of contributing. You get that, so you're not learning a programming language, and you are sort of learning a specific application, but it's more than that. It's how do we use open source software, and who do we ask if we have problems, and can we make contributions, and do we have anything to say to this community, even though we're doing it in this academic setting. And so that was really successful, and that's something that we need to work more on, at least for collection space, is getting out more, I think, into the classroom. Because it's free. You can't download and install and customize the other collections management systems. So if you want experience with them, you can't get it. And so here are some opportunities to use these pieces of software that you're going to be expected to know, the day that you graduate.
I can't agree with that more. I also think one thing that I also think one thing that library schools get a little bit hung up on is there are so many things that people could possibly need to know. One of my favorite parts of my master's research was asking people who were actively working as developers in libraries what they thought that librarians, that outgoing library students should know. And the variety of responses I got took up 2 pages of a table that I made, including like web standards, JavaScript, Git, just across the board, every single skill that you could possibly think of in computer science, how to do patches, how to do code review. And I think that it's easy to get hung up on that. But I also think that having good pathfinders within MLS programs can really help people, because 2 years goes by a lot faster than I think a lot of people realize. And it's often not until the second year that you realize what you want to be doing. I think that helping people find their way at the beginning and figuring out what differentiates us from necessarily a computer science program, because we're not teaching computer science. While library students want to learn programming, this is not a computer science program. This is different. So what differentiates us, but also what can we teach that's useful and dynamic and also going to serve students in the long term?
Well, and both of you touched on other aspects other than just the raw programming. We can add other things in there that open source communities need. How do you write good documentation? So technical writing skills. How do you make a good bug report? How do you triage a bad bug report? So I guess the curriculum can be broader than just programming, although that you can have exercises that gives a taste of that. But the other parts of, if you are going to align yourself with an open source community, these are the other kinds of skills that you need to have. John Bryce also says to introduce open source tools in library schools, we need to have a textbook that explains how to implement open source in libraries. And so there's some of that background curriculum development work that's needed as well. Laura Blanchard, I'm going to call this out because you put it on Twitter. Granny needs a hearing aid. Software carpentry is actually softwarecarpentry.org.
Oh, wait, what?
Software carpentry.
Oh, no. Softwarecarpentry.org.
And there's a dash. Software
And
dash.
there's a dash.
Yeah.
We also have a GitHub site where we're working on documentation for the new implementation for libraries and also data carpentry, which if you're interested in, I don't know if I have grant access, but I don't know if I can grant you access, or anyway, anyone can commit to it. But I don't. I can put you as on a. Anyway, email me. If you're interested. Sorry.
And you will be following up with your blog post, you say.
I will
So,
also be
yes.
following up.
Yep.
with
So
my blog post.
keep an eye out for that. Blake Carver also says, and I can't believe I forgot this given my own paranoid delusions, also don't forget about good security practices too, and not only in coding but also looking at the output as usability as part of using the software, looking for those security implications as well. We have reached the end of, not necessarily of the time, but of my set of questions and what's come in so far. So I'm going to give our audience a chance to tweet or put other questions in, but also to give you maybe just a time to wrap up, reflecting on what each other have said, and some of the takeaways that you've gotten so far from the symposium. Megan?
Sure. So I think, my very first slide, and I'll be honest, we put it on a T-shirt and sent them out to people. We didn't ask. We asked their sizes. We didn't ask if they wanted a T-shirt. I guess they could have not given me their size. But, it says, we are collection space. And I think that what I like about this room and what I like about, something that Jenny asked earlier is that now, we are collection space, even though, people in this room maybe don't work at museums or aren't contributors. But, I think for me, it's... I'm excited about the prospects of even our non-echo chamber is maybe still an echo chamber. And so the idea of expanding out and saying, are there people in the marketing world who will explain to me better what marketing is? And are there people in other domains, or even just people, as somebody asked on the site, private collectors, who could be contributing? So I think I'm excited, my community has expanded for having been here, and that's really exciting. So thanks, of course, to Peter and Lyricist for putting this on.
Absolutely. Sure. Aviva?
I think that just being able to have a forum to talk about a lot of these issues, to get a couple of out has just been really, really exciting. And I'm really hopeful that, first of all, I am also thankful that to Ellen Foundation for being able to put this on. I'm really hoping that this is kind of the beginning of a large number of future conversations that we can have about this, because even though we're all working on different projects, we all are sort of part of the same kind of open community, and I'd like to see that continuing.
Thank you.
I completely agree. I completely agree with what Megan and Aviva said. I think sometimes in my work, it can be a little bit blinders on. Like, I am focused on how to bring contributors to my project. And I think that happens with every project that one works on. Like, I want more people to contribute to Mozilla because I believe in it, essentially. I mean, it's given me a lot, and I hope that it can give other people, that the project can give that to other people as well. And it's provided me this community. And I think that the more connections that we can make together, particularly me coming from a frankly very different world, into tech, into open source tech, I feel really excited to have these conversations, to be able to talk about not only what my organization is doing to support cultural heritage, which honestly sometimes feels a bit scattered, but to see what's going on actually in the field, and actually, and also by people who care about the same things and with whom I can make these kinds of connections, and who hopefully want to make these connections with me, because it's really only together can we make this viable for a variety of communities. If we don't bind together as a series of not even disparate communities, as communities of choice and of practice, and that want to come together, we can really make these solutions tangible for more kinds of institutions, for more kinds of organizations. And I really can't thank you, Peter, and Lyrasis, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation enough for bringing us all together, not only in this room, but in the internet.
Definitely, definitely. So now it's your turn to talk amongst each other as you would in the hallways after a keynote address, or as you might do on the elevator back to your hotel room, just as if you were here in person for this symposium. The discuss.phosphorlib.org site will remain open overnight. As you continue through your day and through tomorrow morning, I encourage you to come back to the discussion site to see what others have said and written, and add your own thoughts and questions to the conversation. You can come back to the homepage of discuss.phosphorlib.org and use the new link up at the top to see newly added topics, and the unread button to see which topics you have been monitoring have new posts. Use that Create Topic button on the front of the site to start a discussion around another question, idea, or experience that you have about open source software in cultural heritage organizations. I'll be back at the start of the live broadcast tomorrow to offer a summary of the overnight discussions as the first presenter of the second day of the symposium. Tomorrow's symposium topic is around what does it mean to adopt an open source package. So this first day we've talked about the conditions that a package can inspire to have good community engagement. Now the focus is on the adopters. What does it mean to adopt an open source package? And we have two prepared talks, John Bryce from Meadville Public Library and Stuart Miller from the University of Chicago. So please come join us again for that. If you're watching this recording, please know that Lyrasis is committed to allocating the resources to keep the discussion site running for as long as it's active and useful to the community. To our future selves, we look forward to your questions and observations about open source software and cultural heritage organizations. This symposium is but one of an array of offerings that Lyrasis has to support open source software. There's also the PhosphoRlib, the main phosphorlib.org site, which has a series of decision support tools for organizations exploring whether open source software is right for them. The PhosphoRlib site is also a registry of open source packages geared towards cultural heritage organizations with ways to keep updated on new releases and related events. Coming soon to the PhosphoRlib site are to be 3 case studies of academic and public libraries that have adopted open source software. If you've signed up for this symposium, you can expect an email from me when those case studies are available. If you came into this symposium because you saw a Twitter message, I'll offer my late welcome to you and email me so that you can get on that list for updates. Lyrasis, that's been hosting this, is a nonprofit member-governed association of libraries and other cultural heritage organizations that is committed to helping institutions create, organize, and manage the resources under their stewardship. If you would like to know more about our programs for commercial content licensing, our digitization collaborative, or our consulting services, or our hosting of Islandora archive space and soon-to-be collection space, please contact me or another Lyricist staff member, or visit our website at www.lyricist.org. And with that, I thank the in-person audience here in Atlanta. I thank our virtual participants. I want to give a special shout out to our panelists for joining us here today and sharing their wisdom and experience. And I will ask the Atlanta audience to clap, and virtually I will ask you to clap as well. So thank you, and we will see you again tomorrow at 12:30 Eastern Daylight Time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.